Most of us know Marc Steiner as the radio talk show host who has graced the air for 20 years, featuring the voices of those whom society might choose to ignore, advocating for the arts and challenging the status quo. But who is this guy really? Is he just a rabble-rouser, or is there a reason for his commitment to standing up for the underdog? You might say, regarding his passion for social justice, that Marc Steiner got it honest. His parents met in World War II England, where Albert was serving as an army doctor, and Maisie, later known by her middle name Anne, was a British ambulance driver. Albert went AWOL to marry Maisie in September 1944. Less than a year later, as they headed for the United States, she gave him a birthday present, suggesting that he may learn more about his country by reading it. It was a copy of Richard Wright's Black Boy. When Albert returned to his hometown, Baltimore, with his new bride, he created an ear, nose, and throat medical practice and became known for his kind, thorough, and just treatment of his patients. He was one of the first doctors to integrate his waiting room. When he refused to move one of his patients post-surgery into the colored ward, the now famous Henry Parks of Parks Sausage, his act forced the integration of the Baltimore Eye, Ear, and Throat Hospital.
These were people who had profound friendships, and it wasn't that just the children were leading the way. There was that they were rebelling against the family values. The family values were universal.
Meanwhile, Anne created her own world, which over the years included a deep friendship with Marion Banfield, founder of the Baltimore Ethical Society.
They clicked because they were both very progressive.
When Marc was 14, he taught Sunday school at the Ethical Society with Marion's oldest daughter, Sondra. The middle Banfield daughter, Karen, was also often at the Steiner home.
We just didn't even look at each other racially. It was just Brian Steiner, Marc Steiner, Karen Banfield. That's just the way we were.
A turning point in Marc's life occurred at age 11 when he joined the Boy Scouts. He joined Troop Number 567 at Faith Baptist Church on Ashland Avenue in East Baltimore, whose scoutmaster was Dennis Foster. Dennis was the nephew of Mrs. Moselle Jackson, a much-beloved friend who worked in the Steiner household for some 30 years. In the segregated Baltimore of 1957, Marc integrated the all-black troop, and the experience shaped his consciousness. His best friend in the troop was Edwin Johnson, and they often spent time at each other's home. The Steiner home in the predominantly middle-class Jewish Forest Park neighborhood, and the Johnson home in the predominantly working-class African-American East Baltimore.
Marc had the nerve to come over to an African-American community, and this is the real hood back in the day, and said that he wanted to be a part of our gang, which was the Boy Scouts. And we just locked together real good. I think because I did not like people trying to down people. And since Marc was a minority in a majority group, I think that just made me cling to him and he clinged to me, and we became great friends.
Marc started his high school career at Baltimore City College. While he was at City, he participated in a number of sit-ins, and in fact, at age 16, was the youngest civil rights worker in Maryland ever arrested. Being a civil rights activist wasn't popular with all the teachers and students at City. Marc ended his career there midway through his junior year, when he had an altercation with one of the teachers, which started over the fact that a young black woman, Yvonne White, had been named the first black student to serve as queen of the City Poly game. Marc and his parents decided that he would finish out his high school years at the Stockbridge School in Western Massachusetts. When the headmaster of the Stockbridge School, Hans Mader, came to Baltimore to interview Marc, he asked Marc who his heroes were. Marc replied, Che Guevara and Malcolm X. Mader, who had been a part of the anti-Nazi resistance in World War II Germany, smiled and said, "You must come to my school." Marc repeated his junior year there and graduated in 1965. At Stockbridge, Mark's world once again expanded as he lived alongside students of all backgrounds, including sharing a room at one point with classmate Arlo Guthrie, and studied under a diverse array of teachers. Mark has remained close with many of his friends from Stockbridge.
I first saw him coming out of the boys' dorm, and he was wearing a pork pie hat and his jacket and these pants that were just outrageous. They were, I don't even know what they were. They were kind of, I can't remember the fabric exactly, but they were kind of tight on top and they flared out, and not like bell bottoms, but they flared out to about 22 inches. Well, he was very proud of that 22-inch cuff.
In February 1965, Mark's hero, Malcolm X, was murdered. Mark traveled to Harlem and stood outside in the cold with the other mourners at the funeral procession. The fall of 1965 brought another tragic death to Mark's world, when a former classmate and dear friend of his from Stockbridge, Adrienne Cooper, died from a back alley abortion in her dorm room at Howard University. Mark has been an outspoken advocate of a woman's right to choose ever since. After high school, Mark attended the University of Maryland, became a leader in the local Students for a Democratic Society, or SDS, and was active in the anti-war movement and the underground newspapers and media.
He was talking about being in Washington at that time, working for SDS, recruiting people for the anti-war movement from the civil rights movement, and this light went off in my head. It was sort of one of those little memory things, a little memory chip came forward, and I remembered looking at him that he was the guy that I'd had that conversation with all those years ago in that church.
In 1968, Mark went on the first of his 2 excursions to Cuba, this one with SDS. The second trip was in 1998 with former Baltimore Mayor Kurt Schmoke. After returning from Cuba, Mark became involved with the Poor People's Campaign. He helped organize the poor white contingent living in Resurrection City, a makeshift encampment on D.C.'s Capitol Mall, of people who came from across America to continue Martin Luther King's movement for economic justice. Later in 1968, Mark entered Franconia College in New Hampshire. In early 1970, Mark returned to Baltimore and began a work-study program as a street club worker. Mark still remains in contact with a number of his kids from that time period.
He was assigned to go out and reach out to young people around the city and get them involved in wholesome, positive activities and help guide them in the right direction. And he was exuberant. From the first time that I met him, I could see that he was passionate and exuberant about trying to make a difference in people's lives.
Also in 1970, Mark became involved in Baltimore's thriving collective movement. Mark and his cohorts helped form the first interracial tenants union group in Baltimore, organizing the working class communities of Waverly and South Baltimore. They helped create the People's Free Medical Clinic, which remains open to this day, as well as the People's Free Garage and the Waverly People's Food Co-op. In 1972, Mark returned to Franconia, where he finished a book of poetry, wrote his thesis on Lenin's theory of state, and graduated with a degree in political theory and creative writing. After Franconia, Mark returned to Baltimore and secured a job at a private nonprofit organization called Pretrial Intervention with his friend Avon Bellamy, where he provided intensive group counseling with youth who had been arrested. During this time, he also took classes on psycho and sociodrama. He especially resonated with Augusto Boal's Theater of the Oppressed. He started his first theater company, and they performed a play he had written called Doors of a Junkie's Dream. Mark began work at Baltimore's Antioch University on his master's degree. He completed his degree in communications and the use of videotape recording and group therapy. After earning his master's, Mark worked again with Avon as a reading teacher and counselor at Baltimore Prep. It was a program of classes and counseling that assisted high school dropouts in returning to school. During this time, he met and worked with Sheila Dixon, who later became Baltimore's mayor. In 1975 and 76, Mark ran a group counseling program at the Maryland Correctional Training Center in Hagerstown, part of a federally funded program with youth under 21 who were incarcerated in adult populations. During this time, an old family friend asked Mark to look up her son, Stanley Johnson, who was incarcerated at Hagerstown. Mark did look him up, and eventually the two of them started a theater project in the prison. Thus began a long friendship between Mark and Stanley, now known to the world as the award-winning actor Charles S. Dutton. When the grant supporting the Hagerstown program ended, Mark came back to Baltimore and worked at Morgenthaler Vocational Technical High School, or MIRVO, as a special needs counselor. Here he launched his next theater group and also helped start a club for expectant mothers, where young women and their boyfriends were taught parenting skills. In 1980, Mark transferred to Carver Vocational Technical High School and founded Family Circle Theater, a troupe of high school students that used theater to help express and work through psychosocial issues. After this period of his life, Mark decided to switch gears and created a marketing and research organization called IDOS. He worked with the Maryland State Democratic Party, whose executive director, Barbara Hoffman, later a state senator, gave Mark his first job running a campaign. Mark also helped Baltimore City Councilwoman Mary Pat Clark and now State Delegate Maggie McIntosh set up Mary Pat's first political campaign. In 1983, Mark was the deputy campaign manager for the quixotic mayoral bid of Billy Murphy against William Donald Schaefer. From 1984 to 1986, Mark worked with Billy's brother Arthur to design the Interest on Lawyers Trust Account, or IOLTA program, under the auspices of the Maryland Legal Services Corporation. Mark's job was to sell to attorneys the idea that they should donate a portion of the interest accrued on their trust accounts to programs benefiting the poor and underserved. Then, in 1986, Mark began teaching acting at the Baltimore School for the Arts, a job he continued until 1995. His students included Tupac Shakur, Jada Pinkett, and Josh Charles. The next few years saw Mark working in public relations for Baltimore's Trahan, Burden, and Charles, and at Shepherd Pratt Hospital, where he created a media center. In 1990, Mark pursued his love of acting and studied at the famed Studio Theater in Washington, where he met and immediately became close friends with the now acclaimed actor Robert Wisdom, who went on to play Police Major Bunny Colvin on The Wire. In 1993, Mark ran into Dennis Kita, general manager of the Johns Hopkins University public radio station, WJHU. Dennis told Mark that he was considering starting a public affairs radio show and asked Mark for his ideas. Mark's idea was to let him be the host. So Mark was given a desk, a phone, and 90 minutes of airtime on Tuesday nights. His first show was on the controversial birth control method Norplant. The rest is history.
He is one of the best interviewers that I have ever heard.
It's always interesting how Mark can get these different people together and get a message out, and he challenges everybody.
Mark disagrees with me all the time, but he's fair and we have good exchanges and we know there's nothing personal in it. We know simply that he's wrong.
Mark was the only forum that gave us an expansive opportunity for dialogue and not just for sound bites. And by doing so, he gave us legitimacy, and he gave our concerns legitimacy.
And I think he created an awareness, an education actually for the citizens of Maryland to learn about what same-sex families were.
I just think he's great, a great person, and I love him very much. And so I just want to say thank you, and I appreciate you, Mark Steiner.